At the Alzheimer's Association Western and Central Washington chapter, that's the long name, we serve individuals and families from the Oregon border to the Canadian border, the Pacific Ocean to the communities of Central Washington, 23 counties in all, and about 80% or so of the state's population. So we run pretty fast. So much of what we do is about stories. The amazing stories of the individuals and families that we serve on their journeys with Alzheimer's and other forms of dementia. And it's been a particular pleasure for me to partner with Collin on what has become a series of these presentations and readings and signings of his amazing anthology, Into the Storm. These are the personal stories of some ordinary people doing extraordinary things, confronted with situations that nobody prepares for. And I'm very pleased to have not only Collin, but also Ann Hedrenn, who is one of the contributors with us tonight to share their stories. So my great pleasure to introduce Collin Tong.
Well, it's great to be back here at my old congregation, University Temple. It seems very appropriate because this congregation played such a vital role in the journey that my late wife Linda and I took many years ago. Tonight I'm going to talk about the importance of community and support systems, and I have to really give tremendous credit and gratitude to all the members, friends, loved ones here at the Temple. They really provided, more than anybody else, I would say, such a important safety net and support system for Linda and I as our journey began to enter a very critical phase. I'd like to just talk briefly tonight and share some general reflections about how I came to start this project, this anthology, which I really believe is a collaborative effort, so I don't take any credit for it. Ann Hedrenn is one of 23 writers who shared their personal stories. Many of you know this story, but for those of you who don't, my late wife Linda first began showing symptoms of early onset, or now called younger onset Alzheimer's, at the age of 51. Way back in 1999, we were traveling together on a trip to France, and it was actually here, just the Sunday before we left for France, that Linda was in a tizzy because she couldn't find her contact lens solution. I remember Maurice Keith came to the rescue, one of our resident physicians here. But that was the first indication that something was amiss. We were on vacation, and a number of things Linda had forgotten, and she was a very meticulous person, very, very well organized. When we got back, several things happened, and one day I received a phone call from Linda's supervisor at Seattle City Light. Linda was having some serious problems remembering appointments, asking her coworkers the same questions over and over again. It became apparent that something was wrong. We checked it out with a number of specialists, and then we got the bad news that Linda had young onset Alzheimer's, and that was the start of our very long journey. Why did I write this book? Well, as Bob Leroy later on will share with you in greater detail, Alzheimer's now has become a very serious national and statewide public health epidemic. There are now upwards of 150,000 people living with Alzheimer's here in the state of Washington. It's now the third leading cause of death in our state. Nationwide, the figure is higher, and by the middle, by 2030, the figure will double, and by the middle of the century, worldwide, the figures will triple. I was very fortunate when Linda developed Alzheimer's to reach out to a wonderful organization, which I have the pleasure of joining as a volunteer the Alzheimer's Association. So back in 2005, as I was beginning to see the seriousness of our dilemma, I called the 24/7 helpline at the Alzheimer's Association, spoke to a very, very helpful gentleman who I later discovered was a friend of mine. We didn't know it at the time. And from that point on, the Alzheimer's Association provided just extraordinary support, not knowing really the landscape or terrain of Alzheimer's. What were we getting ourselves into? We were given we met a care consultant, Dr. Jane Tornatori, came to our house, met with us, and developed a comprehensive care plan for Linda. In addition, I joined a Alzheimer's support group made up of caregivers like myself, many of whom were in various stages of dealing with a problem. It turned out to be a life-saving thing. In addition, the Alzheimer's Association provided me with a placement specialist who helped us locate a adult family home for Linda. In addition, I learned about Elder Health Northwest, which is an adult day health program. There are some 36 of those here in the state of Washington. So as we began our journey and Linda was placed into an adult family home, I became involved with the support group. We met once a month, and I was very moved by the stories and discovered that it was just a very life-giving situation. And so what happened was that about 4 years ago, Jerry Large, who is a Seattle Times columnist and a friend of mine, we had studied journalism together, gave me the idea of writing a story about my own personal experience as a caregiver. So I did, and published a story with the Seattle Post-Globe. And surprisingly, it drew a very wide response, and it gave me the idea that perhaps there might be some value in collecting more stories, because I find that stories are very compelling. Stories also are very healing, and they help provide a wonderful roadmap for caregivers, and I thought perhaps this might be helpful for other families who are experiencing the same challenges. I need a glass of water. I think my mouth is dry. Excuse me. So, as Bob is getting the water. So then I began looking around, and through the help of the association and other contacts, I found 23 writers. Most of them are from the Pacific Northwest, but there are a number from the Midwest, from the South, and also from New England. And the result was Into the Storm, Journeys with Alzheimer's. I think stories are really important, and I was inspired by a number of people to put together this anthology. One of them was a professor that I had back in 1989 at Pacific School of Religion, my late professor of theology, Robert McAfee Brown. One summer at the GTU, I took a course called The Theology of Storytelling, and we read some powerful works by Alice Walker, by Ursula Le Guin, by the novelist and theologian Frederick Buechner, and also Elie Wiesel, the Holocaust survivor. And out of that, I came away with the idea that stories are sacred, that stories are healing. And so it gave me the idea that by compiling and curating a collection of stories about caregiving, that this could provide a way of entry for caregivers who are dealing with a number of really difficult issues. One of them is isolation. When you're a caregiver, you are suddenly thrust into a very chaotic, very frightening and confusing situation. Stories help us to see the landscape more clearly. As Peter Schaefer, the playwright, once said, stories help us to see more clearly in the dark. So stories help us to see our situation and learn how to be more effective caregivers. The other thing is that caregivers feel isolated. As your loved one begins to undergo behavioral changes, begins to wander, begins to lose their cognitive ability, it becomes really important that you are connected with other people. One of our late pastors here, Reverend Mark Poole, a wonderful friend, was actually instrumental in the very beginning stages as I was groping around and said, Collin, you really need a community to come embrace you, and certainly they did that. So I'd like to read a short selection from just one story in this book by Rita Bresnahan. Rita is a psychotherapist in Seattle. She wrote a story called Bread for the Journey, which is taken from her book, Walking One Another Home, Moments of Grace and Possibility in the Midst of Alzheimer's. I think this is a powerful piece because she talks about the unexpected moments of grace that she encountered in what is otherwise a very challenging and very difficult journey. What was curious to me at the outset of Mom's disease was that I too felt disoriented. Although I had read volumes on Alzheimer's, I could find no clear roadmap, no specific time frame to mark the passages. In my disoriented stage, I began pondering, where am I going? How do I get there? It is only natural then at this soul-searching time that I should insist upon asking myself, so if there is no clear roadmap out there, Rita, how will you find your way as a companion through the Alzheimer's journey? I found inspiration from many sources, but one book by Phil Cosino, The Art of Pilgrimage, spoke to me most deeply. His wise words, we can transform any journey into pilgrimage with a commitment to finding something personally sacred along the road, she writes. Only as I opened to the sacredness of this image did I begin to understand the uniqueness and the depth of such a pilgrimage through Alzheimer's. Pilgrims leave their comfortable everyday surroundings to venture, at least for a while, into challenging and unfamiliar territory. Often they journey to places where a holy presence is felt, places credited with healing powers. Consistently, I felt a holy presence when I was with my mother, and her tiny nursing home room offered healing at many levels. True, absurd dilemmas often arose, stirring strange and unwelcome feelings in me. At such times, I would become impatient or preoccupied, or even depressed as I witnessed Mom's downward spiral. Watching someone I loved so much fade before my very eyes was not easy, and often made me feel helpless. What could I do? Being helpless seemed pretty much a given in the situation. I myself needed help. But this much remained clear, however. I could do nothing about Mom's deteriorating condition. What I could do something about was my own behavior, my attitude towards what we were facing. I could bring into our interactions greater love and compassion, more patience and flexibility. In each given moment, this is my call. Yes, we walked one another home faithfully, Mom and I, in our pilgrimage to Alzheimer's, in tender and sacred times, through the darkness and the light, step by step, through each story, each encounter, through each day and each moment. I'd like now to invite one of our contributing authors, Ann Hedrenn, to come and share from her story, Northern House. Ann is a award-winning writer and film producer, and she is the author of a brand new book, a memoir about her own journey as a caregiver with her mother, which will be published in September, right, Ann? Through She Writes Press. It's called Her Beautiful Brain. It's my privilege to invite Ann Hedrenn.
It's a pleasure to be here, and I thank you all for coming. My mother knew that something was wrong when she was about my current age. That's a little scary. I'm 57. And we, at the time, blew her off and said, oh, Mom, I'm sure it's nothing. This went on for some years. and she was tested a few times. This was in the early 90s. I think we're better at this kind of thing now. She was finally told when she was 66, Arlene, we think you have Alzheimer's disease. And the reason my book is titled Her Beautiful Brain was because she was very brainy, and people had actually said that about her. She has such a beautiful brain, because she was sort of unique. She won geometry and trig prizes in high school, but she also was an artist, and she ended up teaching English at Roosevelt High School. That was her last stop before she voluntarily retired, because she felt like she wasn't the teacher she wanted to be because of these strange memory problems she was having. Anyway, shout out to the Alzheimer's Association. Like Collin, when my mother was diagnosed, one of my sisters and I and Mom joined a support group, and it was a lifesaver. I learned a lot of things I didn't want to learn at the time. I was in my early 30s. I had 2 young kids. I was really not interested in becoming an expert on Alzheimer's disease, but, such was my fate. Although I wouldn't call myself an expert, I'm still very much a lay person. My chapter in this book is called Northern House, as Collin mentioned. It's not a happy chapter. I dedicate it to all the people out there who are angry as much as they're sad about what's happened to the person they love. Because Alzheimer's is a tough road. It's not an easy slide, as I bet many of you in this room know. It's a tough path. And I'll just leave it at that. A couple things you might want to know before we begin this chapter. My mom grew up in Butte, Montana, so there are some references to Butte, which, as some of you may know, is now an EPA Superfund site after many decades of copper mining have pretty much gouged the town to death. And I'm one of 6 siblings, so I have 3 sisters, and I had 2 brothers. One passed away, but so that's an unusual part of my story too, is navigating Alzheimer's with 5 siblings. Our mom was single, twice divorced, once widowed when she was diagnosed. Trying to find a home for someone who's done a stint at the Seattle Psychiatric Center is like trying to find a home for a paroled sex offender. We weren't yet accustomed to thinking of our mother as a parolee, an ex-con of the dementia world. So we were grateful for Northern House. Lynette, the geropsych social worker, labored hard to find this new address for Mom, but that didn't mean we didn't notice things, like the split level, floor plan in a can dreariness of the place, the peeling Kleenex blue paint, the faint lines of moss creeping up the outside walls, the cloying floral furniture you wouldn't wish on your most impoverished college-age nephew. Mom loved good woods, strong stripes, and straight lines. She would never have chosen Northern House in a million years. And yet, it was surrounded by tall trees, some of them probably 150 years old. Big, patient, second-growth Douglas firs miraculously left standing when the split-level developers came through 40 or 50 years ago. And it was tucked into a winding ravine in a neighborhood just north of the Seattle city limits, not too far from the little red ranch house that she and Dad bought when they were newlyweds. Sometimes I took the old highway to get there instead of the freeway, and drove past landmarks Mom would have loved. Highland Ice Arena, where she, who had grown up skating in Butte, held out her hands and coaxed us away from the edge of the rink. Leilani Lanes, where she dropped off baby Lisa and me in the upstairs nursery, and I watched her through the big glass window, looking so serious as she stared at those pins, and then twirling into her huge, happy smile after the crash of a strike, which I still think is one of the best noises in the world. The round-the-clock staff at Northern House radiated calm and kindness and tree-like patience. Most of them were from Gambia or Ethiopia, and you got the feeling that taking care of people with brain damage and dementia was a breeze compared to some of the earlier chapters of their lives. They had a completely new view of Mom, the view of people who had never known her any other way. Before Seattle Geropsych, in her 2 years at the Lakeview Retirement Community, she had gone from hosting illicit wine parties and modeling at the annual fashion show to yelling at the staff when they tried to call her out of her room for meals and flat out refusing to bathe. But the caregivers at Northern House had not seen any of that transformation, nor had they seen her tied to a wheelchair in the Geropsych day room. They only knew her as the gnomish, white-haired woman who walked up and down the hallway all day, muttering and gesturing, but never tiring herself enough to sleep, who looked closer to 90 than she did to her real age, 70, who had 4 blue-eyed daughters who were impossibly hard to keep straight. They didn't wince at having to cut up her food and feed her with a spoon because they didn't know that just a few months before, she'd been feeding herself just fine. They didn't mind if she yelled through her shower because they knew she'd be calm afterwards, soothed by the warm towel and the brush running through her bobbed hair. Arlene didn't have the thatchy old lady hair of the other women at Northern House. Hers was as fine and straight as her many daughters. Through the looking glass of a disastrous fall, followed by a zombifying dose of antipsychotic medication and the slow detox at Seattle Geropsych, Mom had slipped into the late stage of Alzheimer's. Outings were now too exhausting and overwhelming. My sisters and I no longer got to play the role of liberators, signing her out for family birthday parties or walks or restaurant meals. Now we were visitors. We brought chocolate and photos and flowers from our gardens. We emailed each other constantly, comparing notes about when we planned to visit so that Mom would have visitors on as many days as possible, and then sending updates about how she was doing when we saw her. I often came at lunchtime because feeding her gave me something to do. Sometimes she was happy to see me. Other times she didn't seem to know me. Sometimes she liked it when I sat next to her on the couch and put my arm around her as if I was a teenage boy and she was my girlfriend. Sometimes she liked it when I sang songs, the oldest songs I could think of, songs I remembered her father singing, like "Oh, My Darling Clementine." Whether she was treating me like a daughter or a stranger on any particular day did not seem to have anything to do with how well she liked my cuddling or my laughable singing or the food I was feeding her. She grew tired and cranky if I stayed too long. At least that's what I told myself as I watched the clock tick while I sang, talked, spooned macaroni, all the while feeling like some kind of desperate performance artist who just couldn't get the audience to wake up and was now counting the minutes until I could run from the stage. Herring boxes without topses, sandals were for Clementine. Maybe my sisters and I shouldn't have been so strict about not visiting on the same days. But we knew that if we were there at the same time, we would be tempted just to talk to each other and ignore Mom, and also that it would mean she might not get a visitor on another day. Northern House was not a quick drive for any of us, 25 or 30 minutes each way for Carolyn or me, an hour and a half each way for Lisa or Christy. And we reasoned it was good for Mom in a general sense if the staff knew that one of us might stroll in any old time. What we didn't know is how much any of it mattered to Mom. There are so many kinds of loneliness. There's the eerie isolation of being packed into a subway or walking down a crowded street where no one dares to make eye contact. Or the pressing in of the walls when you're alone in a new town and have no one to call. But I've never felt as lonely in all my life as I did when I visited my mother at Northern House. To sit across the table from the person who was the very first person I loved, the very first person to love me, to try with all my might to will her eyes to meet mine and then to have to give up, to accept her eyes not seeing me, and then to have one of her well-meaning caregivers comment on how pretty Arlene looks today, her lovely skin, her clean white hair. I wanted to shout, "Who cares? She's gone. Can't you see that this is not Arlene? This is an old woman rag doll who we are all pretending is still a living person. Can't you see that the reason I have to leave the very minute the clock strikes the hour is not that I have so much work to do," which is what I always say, "but because I have to get in my car and drive down the street until I'm out of your sight, and then I can stop and let out this sob I've been strangling on for the last half hour?" This went on for 4 years. Each visit, another downhill step, another bit of bad news to report. She won't stand up straight. She won't stand up at all. 4 years, from walking and muttering to limp and mute in a wheelchair, all connections between brain and muscles severed. And during those 4 years, the visits to Mom were sandwiched between all the rest of my life, just as they were for my sisters and for my brother when he visited from New Jersey. Sandwiched. Sounds so easy, a simple matter of tucking the ham in between the bread and the lettuce. But it never was. It was never easy to tuck a known mood wrecker into the day, to know that I was going to get up from my desk, get in my car, and drive into a wall again, and then recover again, like the world's most resilient crash test dummy. It was never easy to do it, not knowing how many months or years I was going to keep doing it, which meant I couldn't have a big breakdown every time. I just couldn't. It wouldn't be fair to my husband or children or friends or workmates. So I learned what I needed to do to smother the sadness and get on with the day. I stopped for the sob down the block from Northern House, and then if I had time, I did some transitional something between the visit with Mom and having to function in the world of my daily life. If I had time, I went to Third Place Books, over the hill from Northern House. If I felt too wrecked to browse books, I would browse magazines in their cafe over a bowl of soup, a practice the store graciously allowed. There were a few friends I could walk with or have lunch with immediately after visiting Mom, and I could either talk about her or not. But there were many people I felt I could not see or talk to right after seeing her. My dad and stepmom, for example. They couldn't help being healthy and athletic and youthful. It was irrational of me to think of their good fortune as somehow unfair. But here they were, flying back and forth to Phoenix for their tennis and golf and sunshine, while Mom lived out her shredded life at Northern House. And here I was, that old divorce scar tissue flaming up whenever Dad asked, "How's Arlene?" I knew it made no sense, and yet it was true. Maybe all grave illnesses do this to families, bring up old hurts, inflame old wounds. But Alzheimer's disease has its own particularly insidious torture methods. One is the open-endedness of it. There is no 3-month, 6-month, couple of years if you're lucky kind of diagnosis as you might get with cancer. It could be a year or a decade or 2 decades. Mom's body was strong, so I couldn't afford not to tamp down the sadness after my visits. I had to conserve emotional energy. Another of Alzheimer's tortures is that once you've passed a certain point, you can no longer talk about it with the person who has it. There's no crying together about the awfulness of fate. There are no goodbyes. If Mom was raging against her illness somewhere deep inside, we didn't know it. She couldn't tell us. I wondered often at Northern House if she was raging, if her pacing and muttering, and later in the wheelchair, her sudden bursts of incoherent agitation were her ways of trying to say, why? Why can't you get me out of here, out of this canyon, this cavern? Why can't someone or something or some drug get in here and clear a path through my brain? She was so helpless, so lost. Watching her, we were too. Lost and gone forever. Dreadful sorry, Clementine. Thanks.
Thank you, Ann. We've brought some literature from the Alzheimer's Association that provides more detail about services available for caregivers and their families. And now I'd like to invite Bob to tell us a bit more about those services and also give us some additional information about the new developments with the National Alzheimer's Plan Act. Bob.
We believe we are in the business of providing help and hope. And we do that in a variety of ways. We have a toll-free helpline. It's professionally staffed 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. And the folks at the other end of that line answer a variety of questions. My husband can't seem to balance the checkbook anymore. I'm not sure what's going on. My mom got lost on her way to the grocery store the other day. She's been living in the same neighborhood, shopping at the same store for 30 years. We know something is wrong. can you offer any suggestions on where we might go, a doctor, a clinic, to get some help? My husband is so much bigger than I am. I can't get him out of the bathtub. What should I do? Our website contains a wealth of information, resources, referrals for care and support. Collin mentioned, as did Ann, our support groups. We work with over 100 across our chapter's service area for persons with dementia, for their care partners, for members of their family. We have a number of specialized support groups. We have 14 now specifically for folks in the early stage of the disease. And for us, early stage means within the first 6 months of diagnosis. So these support groups are open to both persons with dementia and their care partners. We also have an expanded program for early stage couples that really focus on social engagement. One of my favorites is a partnership that we have with Seattle Park and Rec. Every Monday morning we have a group of early stage folks that walk the zoo together. And they talk to the animals, and then they go into the pavilion and talk to one another over coffee and pastries. I've had an opportunity to walk the zoo with them on 2 different occasions, and it's absolutely uplifting for me and more importantly for them. You know, on the walk with the animals, with one another in the pavilion, there's no dementia in the room. They're talking about life. They're talking about family. They're talking about friendships. And some of the friendships that are born in our support groups are so valuable and so wonderful and extend far beyond the support group monthly meetings. We have a couple of online programs. One of them is called Alz Connect, where folks get on the web at any hour of the day or night and connect with each other. We have a peer-to-peer program so that folks who have been on their journeys with the disease for a while can connect to folks who are just starting and offer them a particular kind of support to kind of work against the particular loneliness that Ann described and that all folks with the disease and their care partners feel. We have our Connections program, ongoing specialized care consultation for individuals and families, often in their own homes, often extending for a period of several months, sometimes even longer, because one of the challenges with Alzheimer's is it's a progressive disease. And as the disease progresses, needs, dynamics, challenges, stresses change. We offer community education for both family and professional caregivers. We just offered our 29th annual regional educational conference a couple of Fridays ago at the convention center. We had almost 600 people, many of them professionals, but a good many family caregivers as well, coming for some relevant, evidence-based, dementia-specific training and education. And we're taking that show on the road. We've done community conferences for family caregivers in Snohomish County. We did one in Everett last fall and one in Linwood last month. We did our first community conference in Burlington last fall for both family and professional caregivers. And you know, we would have been pleased to have 30 people show up. We had 117. It's reflective of not only the growing impact of the disease on more and more individuals and families and communities, but on the need, the interest, the almost desperation for help, for information, for education, for connections to other community resources. We've had a very exciting time in, of all places, Olympia. Just at the end of the last session, the end of March, Governor Inslee signed a bill that provides authorization for us to begin work on an Alzheimer's disease plan for Washington State. We were one of only 6 states that hadn't even started work on the plan. And what the plan will do is pull together all of the services and supports that are within the purview of state government to provide. So we're very, very excited about this. We're going to begin work on the plan under the auspices of the Department of Social and Health Services in early September. The Alzheimer's Association is the largest private funder of Alzheimer's research in the world. Over the last 30 years, we've awarded more than $300 million in grants, many to innovative projects offered by young researchers, several of whom are part of the robust clinical and research community in the greater Seattle area. So we're involved and engaged in a lot of different ways to help the people we serve, and also to simply make people aware that there is help and hope. There is an Alzheimer's Association. So with that, I'd be happy to answer any questions you might have about the disease, about the science, about the association, or the work we do here locally. Any questions? Yes, sir.
It's a great question. Alzheimer's is a form of dementia. It's actually the most prevalent form of dementia, but there are probably more than 70 different kinds of dementias. If you think of dementia as a kind of an umbrella term, many folks are dealing with dementias other than Alzheimer's. Vascular dementia, which is often characterized by a series of small strokes, Lewy body dementia, frontotemporal dementia. Oftentimes people are dealing with more than one kind of dementia. So it's a pretty complex pathology. But that's the important thing to know. Alzheimer's is a form, but only one form of dementia. Okay. Yes, ma'am. It very likely could have been. My family is a microcosm of the history of the disease. My aunt, my mother's sister, back in the 80s was diagnosed with hardening of the arteries because they didn't know what else to call it. My mother, in the 90s, was diagnosed with dementia. She was never diagnosed specifically with Alzheimer's. My father was diagnosed 14 years ago with Alzheimer's. So the science of the disease and the tools for diagnosis and detection have really advanced significantly in the last 20 to 25 years. But it was either hardening of the arteries or senility back in the day. Well, we're learning a lot more about the hereditary predisposition to the disease. In a relative sense, it occurs in the minority, but it can have a devastating effect on individual families. We have a wonderful volunteer partner and advocate, Miriam Marquez, who was diagnosed about 4 years ago. She is one of five siblings. 4 of the 5 have been diagnosed. Her father was one of 14, and 9 of the 14 died of Alzheimer's. So one of the things that is coming into sharper focus around the genetic predisposition to the disease is how to really work with these families. Miriam and others are part of a research project that was funded by the Alzheimer's Association called the DIAN study, the Dominantly Inherited Alzheimer's Network. And this is a group of families from around the country who are part of this study. Miriam goes down to UCLA Med Center every spring for a battery of tests to track the progression of the disease and also the efficacy of the treatment. So we're learning more about the causes of the disease, certainly about these genetic anomalies that can dramatically increase an individual's risk. Sir, you had a question? The first thing to say is that no 2 cases are alike, even within a family. So trying to generalize about the impact of a particular treatment protocol or a particular drug is very difficult. The good news is we have over 100 drugs in various stages of clinical trials right now, and some of them are progressing. We're cautiously optimistic.
There are some challenges around the clinical trials process, though. First of all, they take a very long time. Second, they're very expensive. And third, often they're difficult to populate. We launched a new online tool about 3 years ago now called Trial Match, where an individual can go online and complete a profile and talk with one of our counselors and be matched to an existing clinical trial or trials. Obviously, the process of moving the trials forward is slowed even more if we can't find enough viable candidates to participate. The other thing that we're learning, and it's such a simple thing, is that how you live really can make a difference. The lifestyle choices that you make, what you eat. And I always look around for my wife, because I'm going to tell you how important it is to eat vegetables. But she can never hear me say that, because I don't eat them at home. Your diet, remaining active, mentally active, physically active, socially active. You're not going to prevent or cure the disease, but what you could very likely do is prolong quality of life for a longer period of time. And for folks with this disease, buying time is a very important part of the equation. So the lifestyle choices that really all of us can make and should make, even if we never develop Alzheimer's. One of the cliches in this line of thought is, if it's good for the heart, it's good for the brain. So, yes, sir. Oh my gosh, yes. I think I heard it. Yeah. Collin offered some statistics. We believe that there are currently about 150,000 Washingtonians living with either Alzheimer's or another form of dementia. There you go. The other part of the, yeah, that's about right. It's a little about 5.4 million, yeah. But the other thing that's important about it is our projections and the impact of the disease on the families. So on average, there are 3 caregivers for every person with dementia, and most of them are unpaid family members. So that means we're talking about roughly 350,000 of us that are taking care of loved ones right now with the disease. That's a total of 500,000 people. That number is projected to triple by mid-century. So we really do have a public health epidemic. The other thing that's important about this is Alzheimer's is also the most expensive disease in America. If you look at it, and those of you who have been involved as caregivers can certainly appreciate this. If you look at it in terms of the cost to the federal government, the cost of caring for Alzheimer's this year is about $224 billion with a B. 150 of that is direct Medicare and Medicaid costs. So in the current year, in Medicare dollars, it costs 3 times more to care for someone with Alzheimer's than it does for someone with any other chronic disease. In Medicaid dollars, where the focus is really long-term care, that ratio is 19-1. So in very simple economic terms, Alzheimer's disease in and of itself will bankrupt our healthcare system by mid-century. We estimate by mid-century the annual cost of caring for Alzheimer's in this country will exceed $1.2 trillion. Well, you're absolutely right, although one of the encouraging signs is the pace at which the science is advancing. What will allow us to continue that pace, though, this is the other part of the funding issue. For every dollar the federal government spends on Alzheimer's care, they currently invest 2.5 cents on Alzheimer's research. That's about par for the course. It actually isn't. And here's the other cause and effect. If you look at annual federal funding for chronic disease research, in the current funding cycle, there's over $5 billion dedicated to cancer research. There's about $3 billion allocated to HIV/AIDS research. There's about $2.2 billion going to cardiovascular disease research. Here's the good news when that kind of commitment is made to chronic disease research. We're seeing declining death rates in several cancers. declining death rates in cardiovascular disease, declining death rates in HIV/AIDS. So sustained, significant investment in research makes a difference. The issue for us with Alzheimer's disease right now is we're getting less than $600 million dedicated to Alzheimer's disease research in the current funding cycle through the National Institutes of Health. That has to change. And we're not suggesting it's a zero-sum game. We're not arguing that money be pulled out of cardiovascular disease research so it can be invested in Alzheimer's research. But we've got to find the mechanism to drive more money to Alzheimer's research. Yeah, I don't. Yeah, I can't answer that broadly. I can say, and I'll kind of answer it in a roundabout way, one of the things that is most important to us is connecting with people sooner rather than later in the disease process so that the person with the disease can actually have a voice and articulate his or her wishes about his or her future. Yeah, there's actually a wonderful new document that was drawn by some local folks at Seattle University that is a comprehensive medical power of attorney for folks with dementia. And it addresses in great detail a lot of really important issues. It is. It's a global public health epidemic, really. It's fascinating to see, though, how it's approached in other countries. There are some extraordinary models being developed in Europe around what we like to think of as dementia-capable, dementia-friendly communities that really will allow people with the disease to stay at home, stay in the community longer. There are also some really interesting things in terms of different cultures. You know, we used to hear for many years that there's no Alzheimer's in India. There's no Alzheimer's in Pakistan. And it's because they are in their culture far more inclined to take care of their own in their homes and not come forward and ask for help and seek information. But this is a global epidemic, and it is growing at approximately the same pace across the globe as it is here at home. Well, there is certainly research focused in certain areas. We talked about the genetics of the disease. It has long been widely held that the disease is caused by the accumulation of plaques and tangles in the brain. And one of the breakthroughs in terms of research is a dye that was actually developed at the Alzheimer's Disease Research Center at the University of Pittsburgh a few years ago. And it's a dye that can be injected into the bloodstream, and when it gets into the brain, it affixes itself to the plaques and tangles. And so through a series of tests over a period of time, you can actually track the progression of the disease in terms of the continuing growth of the plaques and tangles in the brain. You can also, again, use this as a way of tracking the efficacy of the treatments, pharmacological and otherwise. It's not widely available because it's quite expensive at this point, but it is an example of how the research is really moving us in the right direction and fairly quickly. A tangle is, it's just a tangle, like your ponytail on a bad day, of neurons in the brain. Yeah, and the thing about Alzheimer's, which is unique among the dementias, is that what Alzheimer's does over time is kill brain cells. And when it's killed a sufficient number of brain cells, the person with the disease loses the ability to do certain basic things. Ann mentioned, you know, the deterioration in her mom to the point where she couldn't stand up. One of the last things that happened, and this was, my father died a month ago, and he couldn't swallow. He forgot how to swallow in the last couple weeks of his life. So that's the particular devastation of Alzheimer's disease. Yeah, it isn't so much about the prevention of Alzheimer's in women, it's about the prevalence of Alzheimer's in women. Yeah. Right now, if you're a woman in America age 60 or older, your chances of developing Alzheimer's are twice that of developing breast cancer.
But it's considerably higher than incidence after age 80.
Well, it is. It is for both men and women. Yeah. Yeah. There's also some significance attached to the prevalence of caregivers. 3 out of 5 caregivers are women. So this disease has a particular impact on women. Yeah. We know that it's far greater in respect to Alzheimer's, and particularly for caregivers. And caregivers are really a focus of our work because it is so very, very stressful for those of you who have been caregivers. You know what this is like. And far too often, it's the caregiver who is the first to die. You know, one of, I think, the handouts that we have in the back is called Know the 10 Signs, and it'll just give you some examples. And without being flip, if everybody loses their car keys. If you don't know what to do with them when you find them, or you find them in the freezer, it may be a sign of something more serious. Yeah. And what you need to do then is go talk to your doctor, and if he's not able to give you the answers that you need, ask him to refer you to someone who can, and if he can't do that, call our helpline. Yes? You know, in terms of, we were talking about lifestyle and things that you can do, I think writing things down, keeping a journal, a lot of the folks that we work with who are living with the disease in the early stages are avid journalists and writers and poets. We have a couple of wonderful early stage individuals who are poets. One of them, Lon Coles, actually had a book of his poetry published recently. So it's about staying engaged in ways that feel good, but that also challenge you a bit. Some of them are pretty simple. If you're right-handed, try doing things left-handed for a while. Yeah. Yes. I would say overall the curve is going up. If you're age 65 in America, well, but I'll get right to it. If you're age 65 in America, your chances of getting Alzheimer's are 1 in 8. If you're 85, your chances are almost 1 in 2. So age is certainly a relevant predictor of the disease, but it's not that simple. First of all, the fastest growing cohort in our population is 85 and older. People are living longer. So more of them are going to live into their 80s and not develop Alzheimer's. You can develop Alzheimer's much earlier in life. We work with a number of people. Collin mentioned Linda was diagnosed at age 51, or at least started showing signs of the disease at age 51. We lost a dear friend just the other day who was diagnosed, I think, in her 40s. Yeah. Also, we're learning more about the likelihood that people may have the disease for years before any symptoms manifest. So it's complicated. Yeah. Yes, ma'am. My father was 98, and with the exception of his hearing loss, which is actually quite profound, he was in really good health. And he lived for over 14 years after diagnosis, but I know that he had the disease. In fact, my mom lived for about 14 years after her diagnosis, and my father, you know, Mom died about 6 weeks before their 62nd wedding anniversary, and Pop was, by God, going to take care of her. I know that had to have exacerbated the progression of the disease in him, but at the time, I really thought it was the stress of caring for her every waking moment, every ounce of energy. And if he lost a word or a thought, it was easy for me to say, well, who wouldn't be forgetful, with the stress that he's living under? So, but you're right. And one of the ironies is we're seeing that often when the disease it manifests and is diagnosed in someone younger, it progresses more quickly. But we've worked with families where the spouse has taken care of husband or wife for over 20 years with the disease.
Prevention or...
I can't say much. Real, eat your vegetables. But really, I can't say much for two reasons. Again, every disease is every case is different, and there's still so much we don't know. I mean, if we knew more about the cause or the impact of at least some of the pharmacological treatments, it'd be easier to say, if this isn't working, maybe you should try that. I will say that a hallmark of the funding for research that the Alzheimer's Association does is we really do look for those innovative projects that are sort of in the gaps, not necessarily in the mainstream with the really popular prevalent theories around the disease. And we look for those other opportunities that are very legitimate and very promising, but aren't getting funding otherwise. And this Diane project is an example of that. And this is a relatively new development in the science. We thought for years and years and years that once you reach a certain age, you couldn't generate new cells. And the reality is you can in your brain. There you go. All right. Anything else? Any other questions or comments? Thank you very much. You've offered some great questions. You've certainly kept me mentally engaged tonight.